This is treatment-free beekeeping, where we talk about the steps you can take or what it's like to try to keep bees treatment-free. From the beginning to hopefully a successful end, we'll go through the process as we experience it in our life on Wildflower Bee Farm. This is treatment-free beekeeping. Let's get started. It is May 19th, 2024. This is Hank for treatment-free beekeeping at the Wildflower Bee Farm. Lots to talk about today about what's been happening here on the farm. I was going to talk about, sort of stick handling through the treatment-free idea, but I think what I'm going to do today is just talk about what's going on, especially since we received our first 2 Russian queens yesterday. I've been spending a great deal of time reading everything I can find and watching every video I can find about the Russian hybrids that we occasionally can pick up. So I thought I'd go through that. Now this is a video, you're watching a hive we picked up from BLB Honey in Dresden. It was going to be and is our sort of donation hive. So when the Russian queens come this week, I have another 4 coming. So I'm going to have 6 different, depending on how many survive, we're going to start with 6 different Russian research sort of projects. The Russian queens are coming just with a couple of attendants. So the question is, I don't have any Russians, so how do I create hives and integrate them? Well, this hive, which is the combination of carnies, Carniolean, and apparently a buckfest. But it looks like mostly carnies in this hive. And they are aggressive, man. They're nasty. But that's okay. Again, this was a hive I picked up from a local beekeeper that said in the fall they were attacked. This hive was attacked by wasps to the point where they basically thought it had failed. Came back in the spring and saw it was incredibly active. So a couple things may have happened. They obviously survived, had to have survived, or and this has occasionally happened here on the farm, an entire hive moved in and took over, which I'm not thinking that happened. So this is kind of a survivor hive from a wasp attack, but also aggression. It had been treated conventionally, so with everything from sugar syrup to mite treatments. But yet I'm going to try to use the frames this week. I need 4 frames from this hive of brood and workers to put into nukes for my queen Russian carny hybrid queens coming from originally from California. Now, it's not something we want to do very often, but to introduce new genetics, you have to go where it is, and that's where they're coming from. So in doing my research, the problem we have is that often conventional bees will reject Russian queens or queens with Russian ancestry. So the strategy is to pull 4 frames from the base, shake off the bees, put them in the top with an excluder to make sure we don't grab the queen. Then take 1 frame and 1 frame of honey and put it into a 5-frame nuke where I have actually walls that I can move. I call them moving walls. Some people call them traveling boards. So that I can actually create a 2-frame nuke that will be queenless for a day. Then I will bring in the queen, the Russian queen, in her cage for up to 3 to 4 days before I put the candy entrance so that the bees can eventually gnaw away, just so that they can get used to her scent, because apparently there's quite an issue with conventional bees. Now, there's some carny in these queens, and there's some carny in these workers. Now, I've emailed the California provider to see if they have any other timelines on introduction. So my plan is to do that, and then obviously within a week remove the traveling board or the separation so that the bees would have access to the entire 5 frames. Now, the bees I picked up yesterday were already with 3 to 4 frames of bees and had been integrated, the Russian queens. And I simply transferred them into an 8-frame and into a 10-frame deep. The 8 frame is actually the hive on our live webcam that's going to be live sometimes this week. We're just doing some software upgrades. Once that's finished, you just have to go to our YouTube channel, and you should be able to watch anytime you want the live entranceway. Now, what I found fascinating, so the hive that you'll see, you're going to be able to watch the entrance quite close, the 24/7 if you'd like. I was amazed last night, the amount of, what should I say? The amount of activity around the entrance after sunfall, when it got dark. The infrared picked it up, of course, but the hive had a number of frames in it from previous hives, so they're doing cleanup, right? They're doing all kinds of cleanup, and there's a mound of basic garbage at the entrance that they're working on, and so it's a hive that has it looked like carnies and some buckfest. So we won't see the Russian carny offspring for about another 3 weeks. So what is at that live cam are the bees from the frames where that queen was integrated. So learned a lot this week about, just from the research, about the process of how the Russian bees came to America, placed on basically an isolated island, and now there's an organization that's dedicated to preserving the initial genetics. Now, when you do some reading and listening, you see that the original Russian bees were actually mutts, just like most of the bees that survive, and that for 150 years they had learned to survive in a very cold climate with no human intervention for mites generally, or any other disease, and these bees survive. Now, there's some research that says the Russian purebreds are actually part of carnies and all kinds of other bees that were brought to that part of Russia by farmers some 150 years ago, and they eventually survived, and that's what we now call the Russian bees that come here. Now, there's the traits associated outside of the trait for fighting disease, which hopefully some of them continue to maintain. There's also traits like a lot of swarming. Let's just take that one. If you remember the diathesis stress model, I talk about all the different factors that they may contribute to a hive failing or a hive surviving. And the idea of swarming initially is thought to be very negative. In fact, when I started digging about what people are saying about Russian bees, which is usually beekeepers or starting beekeepers, most of it's pretty negative. You know, they swarm too much, they're too slow starting, they're aggressive, all kinds of things. Now, we don't really know if the aggression comes from the carniolean or the carny background in the Russian bees, which carnies can be fairly aggressive. But that's why they survive, because they are hypersensitive to threats, whether that be through mites or disease or other animals. So it's hard to really know. But the point of all that is, most of the Russian purebred bees, from what I understand, are similar to what was brought from Russia, but those bees in themselves were not necessarily pure. They're part of a whole host of other bees that were around at the time when this happened. So yesterday I brought them in. They were in simple cardboard containers, and I shook them into these 2 hives. One is on our live stream, and the other is on a Vosker monitor, so we can keep track of what's happening with those bees. I also opened up our 2 survivor hives here on the farm. We're just going to call them dad bees, because they're just mutts, right? We have no idea what they are. They look like a cross between Saskatraz and carnies, but who knows? They seem tiny, the bees. They're smaller than other bees that I've seen. And when I opened them up, if you remember, I did the trial with the queen cups, the plastic queen cups. The one hive had started to look like put wax around them, but the hive only had 3 frames of brood, and I didn't think it was right to obviously split them in any way, because there weren't enough bees, frankly. They just seemed to be plugging along. They're bringing in pollen and nectar. The queen's laying now and then. She's on a holiday or something. I don't know what's going on. Now, there's a lot of honeysuckle, and there's still dandelion, and the clovers are starting to open up. So you'd think the queen would be jacking up her laying, because there's a lot of pollen and nectar going to be happening for the next 2 or 3 months. But anyway, I left the queen cups in there because obviously they don't need to make any. But surprisingly, in the one hive, they had started to make their own queen cup. Even it looked like a super seeger cup, but there weren't very many bees, and there was a lot of space. So I'm totally confused. Now, the other option, which I'm looking at, is how to encourage bees to create more cells that we can use or use as splits. And it looks like the Russian bees are always creating, according to the science, backup cells. They always have a queen cell ready or two in case something happens to the queen. And then what they do is they tear it down. So if the queen's healthy, they just tear it down. If the queen's not, they automatically have a new a new queen to replace her. So that's a pretty interesting adaptation by these bees. And we'll have to see what happens. But think of it, if I were to put a Russian queen in a 2-frame nuke, how quickly could we have replacement cells to continue to expand the line of Russian carny bees? Now, I have no idea. So the other thing that came up was that Russian bees, to maximize, and most bees, I guess, to maximize, you should keep them kind of in the same area. You shouldn't mix Russian bees with other bees, because then if the other bees get diseased, it kind of can really hurt the Russians as well. So what I've got is 3 different areas in the farm. We have a section for the Russian bees in an open area in the forest. So you have to have sun, you have to have protect, and they're all down the center of the farm, protected as much as we can from the pesticides of the neighbors. In front of that, mainly in our clover fields down the center of the farm, I have what I call the Dresden patch, or the traditional patch. So those are the bees like the ones you can see on this video. I've made 2 splits, so there are 2 other hives like this. There's one in a 2-framer experiment, and the other is the hive that's on our infrared to experiment with that, and that's also a split that had queen cells that were transferred over after I did the OTS method. The other section is going to be what I call the dad section, which are the mutt dad bees. And I keep saying if they survive, we're now moving into almost June, and they're still grinding out some brood. So I don't know, man. They are just like on vacation. Maybe they're working from home. I don't know what the heck's going on over there. But I won't open them again for 2 weeks and see if there's anything else going on. But I don't know. I'm just going to say I don't know. The interesting aspect of the hive you can see here is they've already been split, but I took about 4 frames, I guess, 3 or 4 frames, about 3 weeks ago. But the way they're working and the way this queen is going, I kind of have a feeling when I open them up on Tuesday, they will have enough frames to share, or I can always borrow or steal one from one of the hives I set up yesterday, which had a few extra, because really want to have 6 of these Russian hybrid hives sort of hanging around so the drones can sort of propagate. And I also want to use one hive, as I call it, as a swarm bomb that just keeps swarming and just keeps throwing drones out and bees out, and because they're also foul brood resistant. There are these bees that I think I said to you they had been given some foul brood in a way that I think most bees experience a little bit of it occasionally, which then makes them immune. It's like the old style vaccines we had as humans, where they would take a disease or an illness and make sure that it was not going to totally harm us, but they would introduce a little bit into our bodies so that we then develop antibodies. And that's basically what the bees do in nature anyway. It's considered organic. It was the only way I could get Russian queens for the farm. So this kind of is the end of this project with regard to what we talk about, the Darwinian black bee box technique of trying to introduce or create a strain that's typical for this area, can survive in our climate and survive in our vegetation and habitat with the challenges that it does face on a regular basis. And I think that's very important. What I also find interesting is even though there's been a lot of effort to maintain the pure nature of Russian bees. They're not pure bees, let's be clear. The bees that were brought over from Russia were made up of strains of different bees that eventually survived. So my dad's strain here on the farm, even though they're really tiny bees, I'll be interested to know what happens over the course of a year or two when they start having exposure from the Russian drones, and perhaps it'll improve their survival rates. Many of the traits that I saw with the Russian bees are similar to my dad's strain here, where they take out, for example, hive beetles, and I've had videos of that up on the site, or they're, really preoccupied with cleanliness. They're almost obsessive cleaners. They also are slow, and I'll tell you, I've not seen a slower hive than the two that survived our winter. They also don't consume a lot of food in the winter, and sure enough, the 8-framer that's really doing well comparatively had 2 frames of honey left after the winter, and it's an 8-framer, and it had a very small cluster. And with the Russians, it's not unusual, they say, to have a 2 or 3 frame cluster, do very well throughout the winter. So we're going to test all this out, and this is what I call more applied research. So it's research, but we're not manipulating a lot. It's the old horrible A/B design. If you're a scientist, you're saying, well, this is not research. What's this guy talking about? So most of it is observational stuff and trying to adapt to see what survives here on the farm. Now, another thing I'll just say before I go, we're about to get a ton of red clover blossoms. Now, red clover traditionally is not something bees are known to get into because they say they have a hard time getting the nectar from. Well, we're going to see. We're going to see that. But the red clover was planted in reaction to the weed police. I had started that on my own, actually, without the weed police. But I had frost seeded it a few years ago on a section of the land that was very difficult to grow anything on because it was so acidic. It's black muck with peat moss under it. Great for growing carrots and lettuce and all of that if you're a farmer, but when it comes to turning it back over to nature, it was a challenge because the Canadian thistle loved it, and the goldenrod loves it too. But the point is, the red clover basically replaced a lot. We still have some of the thistle, thankfully, but it's very minimal. And the clover will be out, and so it'll be interesting to see. But that adds a little curve. So let's assume, and there's some science that says honeybees will work red clover. That adds another, sort of blip to it, because now we have probably, I would say there's probably 5 or 10 acres of just incredible clover. It's well above my knees in height, and it's just starting to bloom, and we've had rain every other day here, so it's grown incredibly. But that adds a variable to this year's bees where they're going to get that kind of food if they should choose to work it. But there's also honeysuckle now, different shrubs. We have the clover, the Alsic clover from our original 5-year-ago planting. We have white clover. So there's a lot going on here on the farm. Still some dandelions. I'd say the honeysuckle and the wild strawberries are certainly providing a great deal for our bees. So, an interesting time. I'm sorry for the delay, the length of time of this podcast, but lots to talk about. Next week, I hope to talk, there'll be more news on the farm, but I'll also try to address this issue of treatment-free, because I'm sure there's people wondering, well, how do you call it treatment-free? You bring in these bees that are vaccinated, you do splits, you manipulate things, you put out, you're doing infrared. Oh my gosh, infrared, that basically got me kicked out of the treatment-free group because I was talking about infrared. And so I'll keep talking about that. And I'll just tell you what my definition is. If you don't like it, that's fine. You can just say that. But anyway, exciting times. I hope you're having a great day as well. Be well. This is Hank for treatment-free beekeeping at the Wildflower Bee Farm. Have a great day. To learn more about our project, make sure you go to wildflowerbeefarm.com. There you can find further information on the latest research articles we've put out, find out where you can pick up some t-shirts, and all the other interesting things we're doing on the farm. That's wildflowerbeefarm.com. You can also go to beingmoneysimple.org and pick up a free copy of our book, What Grandpa Learned from His Honeybees, a little book to be smart with your money and help the environment. It's free when you sign up for our weekly newsletter. Have an amazing day, and thank you for listening.